Have you ever stopped to reflect on the fate of those who orchestrated the most unjust and infamous trial in history? Imagine for a moment, it is a cold night in Jerusalem. The sky is dark and the streets are crowded, but in a secret corner of the city, the tension is palpable. There are murmurs in the air, and a group of men gather in the shadows. These are not ordinary people. They are powerful figures, the religious leaders of the building, people who should be guardians of the faith, pastors who should be guardians of the faith, shepherds of the spirit of God's people. But that night, something very different is about to happen. At the center of this conspiracy are two characters, Anna and Hur. Perhaps these names are not the same family of Capon Pilo, the Roman governor who gave the final order for the crosses of Jesus. But without A and AF, and like Hur, the completion that led to the condemnation of Christ would not have unfolded in the same way. These priests, who occupied promising positions on the religious scene, assumed a dark role that night. And the most surprising thing is that as they filled a shadow, they were about to be the instruments of a prophet far greater than any of them could have imagined. Annas, the former high priest, and like Hur, the acting high priest, should have been examples of morality and spiritual leadership. Yet it was they who, fearing to lose their influence and power, became the architects of the Messiah's execution. But think for a moment, what happened to these people after that girlish night? Did they simply disappear into the pages of history, or did divine justice catch up with them? The Holy Bible reminds us of a moving truth. Make no mistake, God is not busy. Whatever man sows, that will also be required. Galatians 6:7. This truth is inescapable and inalienable and permeates this entire story. People who have sown corruption and treachery will reap the consequences both in their own lives and in the generations that will come after them. As we work through this story, you will see how even those who try to manipulate and undermine God's justice in order to maintain their own power do not escape the consequences. Annas and Caiaphas were convinced that they were protecting the people and the religion, but in the end, everything they tried to preserve came crashing down around them. But also the institution they tried to protect, the temple, the religious system, their prestigious positions will collapse in a way they could never have foreseen. This leads us to a deep reflection. No one is beyond the reach of God's justice. No matter how powerful or influential people are, even those who wear the robes of religious authority are not exempt. The Bible repeatedly shows us that the power of God sustains every human system and that in the end, truth and righteousness will always prevail. But the story doesn't stop there. What makes this edition even more fascinating is that while Anna and her ilk thought they had orchestrated a threat to their authority, they were actually fulfilling the divine plan. Unknowingly, their actions paved the way for the greatest victory in history, the resurrection of Jesus and the beginning of a movement that would change the world forever. Imagine that night in Jerusalem. Tension in the air, fear in the eyes of those filling in the shadows. They think they are in control, but what they don't know is that they are about to set off a series of events that will reverberate through eternity. Every move they made, every decision they made, was part of a bigger plan, a plan none of them could understand. We open the curtain on one of the most powerful and influential figures in Jerusalem, Anna. Imagine a 60-year-old man with a bar card, his eyes piercing with a calculated coldness, full of cunning. Although he no longer held the official title of high priest, his power was far from gone. Anna was the real driving force behind the decisions that moved the temple behind the scenes. His name may not be mentioned as much as that of Caiaphas, his general, but Annas was a central figure in the circle of religious power. He was appointed high priest by the Romans in 86, a position that was supposed to represent spiritual and moral leadership. However, after only 9 years, Annas was detyped. For many, this would have meant the end of his influence, but not for him. Annas had a much bigger vision and arranged his power in an even smarter way. He got 5 of the fake Messiahs eventually, or like Hur, to succeed him as high priest. Thus, even without a title, he was the real authority behind the throne. His name spread through the streets of Jerusalem and everyone knew. When something important happened in the temple, Annas had an invisible hand that manipulated the flowers. The Bible gives us an idea of this power. In John 18:13 minutes, we see the crucial role of aunts during the war of Jesus. He took them first to Annas, who was the father-in-law like her, the high priest of that year. This shows how great his influence was. Even though he was not the acting high priest, Annas was the first to be consul. He was in control of the situation, and decisions were passed through him before reaching the Sinatri or the lodge. Annas, despite his official absence from office, still dictates the course of events. But why take Jesus to Annas first? The temple under his watch had become more than a place of worship. They were a true marketplace. And who was running this trade? Annas. He had a monopoly over the sale of sacrificed animals and the exchange of currency, activities essential to the corner of the temple. When Jesus entered the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers, he was not only challenging abusive practices, he directly attacked the economic empire of his year. His anger against Jesus was personal. To him, Jesus was not only a threat to his spiritual authority, he saw the Messiah as a direct threat to his power and wealth. And Annas saw the temple as a profitable business. It is almost impossible to imagine the impact Jesus had when, in one act, he exposed the corruption and selfish motivations that ruled that sacred space. Annas' anger against Jesus began there, when the temple was purified. What Jesus saw as a remnant of the house of prayer, Annas saw as the collapse of his profitable business. This anger spoke to Annas to such an extent that he could not see who was standing in front of him. Instead of seeing the Son of God, he saw only a man whose power was threatened. Ironically, Anna, the founder of the temple, became enemies of the truth that the temple represented. His position, which should have been dedicated to guiding the people in the right direction and truth, was the chorus of greed and his desire for control. Let's turn our attention to her, the man who held the title of high priest during Jesus' trial. Imagine her in all her authority, clothed in her robes, wearing the judgment seat, and her head crowned with a turban, symbolizing her high position among the religious leaders of the estate. He was not only a religious figure, but also a skilled player in the political field, who knew how to stay in power for a surprisingly long period, from 18 to 36 graces. This extended mandate reveals much about his ability to balance the delicate game between Roman interests and Jewish religious elites. As she was the general of Annas, and this relationship was not accidental. As we saw earlier, Annas had a network of influence that controlled the Prio system, and as Ephah he was chosen to continue this powerful stock. Even so, she was no mere puppet. He possessed a cold and calculating political intelligence, and this skill was crucial in his conversion to Jesus. The Gospel of John gives us a glimpse into his calculating mind. In John 11:4950, like her, we hear about the population of Corinth and Jesus, and about the risk it represented for the status with, "You know nothing." Do not even think that it is better for one common man to die than for the whole nation to perish. In this statement, she revealed her pramtal. For him, Jesus was not a Messiah or a spiritual figure, but a threat to the delicate balance between Jews and Romanians. The fear of a popular revolt that could bring serious consequences on the part of Rome was palpable. Caiaphas saw the condemnation of Jesus as a necessary evil to preserve what was left of the power and influence of the Jewish elite. Here lies the great iron of storytelling. Without realizing by uttering these words that she was prophesying the very purpose of Christ's death, John in his gospel shows us this divine irony, saying that he, being high priest that year, took advantage that Jesus would die for the nation, John 11:51 minutes. What she intended as a political solution, God turned into an act of redemption for all humanity. The declaration meant to preserve his power as hers became a prophecy of the sacrifice that would bring salvation to the world. However, she was completely oblivious to this great truth. He saw the condemnation of Jesus as a rational act to save his people from Roman wrath. But like the precedent, he also became a symbol of the corruption of the religious system. He was no longer a priest dedicated to the search for truth and justice, but a political leader concerned with maintaining his position at all costs. He did not see Jesus as the fulfillment of the scriptures, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The most dramatic moment of his betrayal occurred during the trial of Jesus, as she, in a contrived scene of indignation, tore her clothes when she heard Jesus conferring his divine identity. In Matthew 26:65, we read that she, when she heard Jesus say that he is the Son of God, tore her white clothes. Why do we need more witnesses? You just heard the blavest. The gesture of his work as Ephah had a double intention. On the one hand, he sought to persuade and influence the members of the council so that they would unite in condemning Jesus. On the other hand, he wanted to demonstrate a religious zeal, a false indignation, to cover his true political motivations. This act of tearing the clothes was symbolic on several levels. According to the Jewish law, the high priest was forbidden to tear his clothes in any process, Leviticus 10.6. In doing so, she violated one of the fundamental rules of her own office. What those reveal hypocrisy and desperation. Hill condemns Jesus at all costs. He was willing to break the laws he was supposed to obey, all to protect his position and power. As such, the figure provides us with a clear example of the danger of putting political and personal interests above justice and truth. He, who should have been the representative on earth, became the architect of the rejection of God's own Son. The decision to sacrifice Jesus was, for him, a means of keeping peace with the Romans. But this choice revealed his spiritual bankruptcy. As the nape of the neck, which should have led the people of Israel on the path of righteousness, became an instrument of betrayal. Imagine a shadow from Jerusalem that night. Jesus, the Son of God, is dragged through the streets under cover of darkness to what would be one of the most righteous and legal trials in history. The usually noisy and bustling city rests in a non-linear quiet as a spectacle of translation and corruption unfolds in the shadows. The Sanhedrin, the supreme council of Jewish leadership, hastily met. There was no time to waste. Jesus was to be condemned before sunrise. But what many may not realize is that this process was full of irregularities and violated the very laws that the priests were so proud to defend. The first and most obvious legality was the time at which the trial took place. By law, trials could not take place at night. Yet here he was, conducting a trial under cover of darkness, with the sole purpose of ensuring that Jesus would be silenced before the people could intervene. In Mark 14:53, we see that Jesus was brought before the Lord at midnight. This demonstrates the haste and desperation of the religious leaders. They could not wait until Zoe, fearing that Jesus' influence would grow even more among the people. Every minute counted, and they were willing to ignore their own laws to ensure that the Messiah was condemned. But this was only the first of many glaring violations. The Synecdoche, the highest Jewish court, had no right to initiate charges. His role was to judge impartially, hear accusations, and uphold justice, maintain justice. However, what we see here is the Sanhedrin himself actively seeking false witness to incriminate Jesus. Matthew 26. The chief priests and the whole congregation sought false evidence against Jesus, that they might condemn him to death. This was not a truth-seeking trial. It was a premeditated conspiracy. The religious leaders were determined to find any pretext, however false, to justify the death of Jesus. The problem does not stop here. In death penalty cases, the law prevents the guilty verdict from being handed down on the same day as the trial. There was a waiting period, a necessary reflection, to ensure that the decision was correct and analyzed. However, Jesus was condemned within hours, shortly after his arrest. The rush to condemn was so great that they flouted all established rules and protocols. The high priest himself, like her, who was supposed to maintain order, of a crucial rule tore his clothes in a gesture of indignation. In Leviticus 21:10, it is clearly written that the high priest should not tear his clothes, but that it was done in order to prematurely reject the words of Jesus. As we see in Matthew 26:65, then the high priest broke his blalumi. Another detail that cannot be overlooked is where the trial took place. The Synecdoche was supposed to meet in the Hall of Carved Stones, a specific place in the temple designed to ensure that trials were conducted in a fair and legal manner. However, Jesus was tried in his home of Jaffa, away from the public eye and away from the legal formalities that his nephew had to follow. This shows the clandestine and rushed nature of this process. It wasn't about justice. It was about a compote to get rid of a threat. And yet, perhaps the most important aspect is that despite all these connections, Jesus remained calm and silent throughout most of the trial. He who could have defended himself with the wisdom and power of God chose to fulfill his destiny. In Isaiah 53, he was taught, he was oppressed, and he was tormented. But he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter and like a heifer that is silent before the thunder. He did not open his mouth. Every injustice, every lie, every deception was part of God's great plan for the salvation of mankind. And even in the face of such a fragrant falsehood, Jesus stood firm, depending on the mission. This legal process also serves as testimony to how far religious leaders were willing to go to maintain their power. They broke their own laws, broke their own principles, broke their own laws, broke their own principles, and became complicit in the greatest judicial error in history. And yet, in the midst of this injustice, God was at work. What seemed like defeat was actually preparing the way for the greatest victory the world would ever see, the resurrection of Christ. As we reflect on this judgment, we remember the words of Jesus in Matthew 23:28 minutes. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but on the inside you are full of dead bones and all nonsense. This description fits the religious leaders of that night perfectly. On the outside, they presented themselves as defenders of law and justice, but on the inside, they were full of corruption, greed, and fear. The trial of Jesus was not just a Jewish scissors, but it was a revelation of the true nature of those who claimed to be the guardians of the faith. The quiet that came over Jerusalem after the crucifixion of Jesus was almost palpable. What seemed like the end of a threat to the religious leaders would soon turn into a flurry of supernatural and unexpected events that would shake Anna's power, as well as the religious system they had worked so hard to protect. They succeeded in condemning Jesus to death, but the signs that followed the crucifixion would make it clear that something much more important was at stake. The expulsion, far from being the end, will mark the beginning of a new era. The first of the immediate consequences was an event that left priests and people in a state of shock. In Matthew 271, it was recorded that, at the exact moment of Jesus' death, the curtain of time was torn in two from top to bottom, the earth shook, the rocks split. The curtain that was torn was not just a piece of cloth. Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in the temple, where only the high priest could enter once a year to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people. When this curtain was torn from top to bottom, it was a sign that what had until then been inaccessible to ordinary people was now open. The barrier between God and mankind had been destroyed, and this had not been done by so-called humans. Imagine the error the priests felt when they saw this. The veil that they believed protected the Holy of Holies, the place where the presence of God dwells, was destroyed without touching it. This supernatural act, far from being a mere coincidence, was a divine declaration that the sacrificial system and priesthood, which he and his likeness seemed to them so much, were drawing to a close. Speaker 1. Access to God, which until then had been limited to a few, will now be offered to all. Jesus' death on the cross fulfilled and overcame the old system. But this was only the first of many signs that would perplex the religious leaders and the people. Shortly after the crucifixion, Jesus' body disappeared from the tomb. Even with Roman soldiers on guard, the empty tomb became a point of contention and doubt. The Gospel, according to Matthew 28:11, reports that the leading priests, desperate to cover up what happened, timidly sent the guards to spread the news that Jesus' body was stolen by his disciples. The irony of this act is glaring. These leaders who had condemned Jesus because of the supposed danger he posed now found themselves involved in a conspiracy to hide the truth of his resurrection. Despite their efforts, rumors that Jesus had risen began to spread like wildfire. And it wasn't just a rumor. The community of the followers of Jesus began to grow rapidly, the hand of testimonies that the resurrected Christ appeared to many. The book of Acts gives us a clear idea of how this movement gained strength. In Acts 2:40, it is recorded that about 3,000 people were baptized on the day of Pentecost, just a few weeks after the resurrection. Imagine the impact on John as she and the other religious leaders, they, or thought to be falling from Jesus, will silence his message. But what happened was the exact opposite. Their power was challenged by something they could not control. The growing influence of the apostles and early Christians became a direct threat to the authority of the priests. Peter and John, for example, openly preached about the resurrection of Jesus in the temple courts, which must have been a great blow to Anna and her who controlled that space. In the Acts of the Apostles 4.1-2, we read that the priests, the chief of the temple guard, and the Sadducees came to Peter and John while they were talking to the people. They were very disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people and announcing in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. The message they tried to suppress was now being preached in places where, before only they had a voice. The priests tried to use their authority to silence the apostles, but their efforts were in vain. When I ordered Peter and John to stop talking about Jesus, they received a firm and courageous answer. Judge for yourself whether it is right in the eyes of God to obey you rather than God. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. The message of the gospel, the good news of the resurrection, was unstoppable. And this was undoubtedly the greatest consequence of the crucifixion for Anna and her. Not only did they lose control of time and the religious system, but they saw before their eyes the growth of a movement that they could not stop. What began as an attempt to silence Jesus turned into a global movement that would change the course of history. And wounded and like her, who thought they were acting to preserve their authority, or faced with a lesson that will be repeated throughout the ages, no one can fight against God's plans and expect to win. Fast forward to about 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, and we find Jerusalem in a time of great tension. The Jewish people, tired of Roman pressure, were on the verge of rebellion. Discontented sects began to turn into falla, culminating in a conflict that would forever change the fate of the city and its people. What many may not have realized at the time was that the events unfolding before them had been prophesied by Jesus years before. He had warned his disciples and the people of the faith that awaited Jerusalem, and now these prophecies were about to be fulfilled in a terrifying way. Remember when up there, as he walked through the temple with his disciples, "Do you see all these things? I assure you that no stone will be left unturned. All will be saved," Mark 13:2. For the disciples, these words must be called by the foolish. The temple was the pride of Jerusalem, the center of the Jewish community, and the symbol of God's presence in the midst of his people. How could such an imposing building, which represented the soul of the Jewish people, be destroyed? But Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, knew that rebellion against Rome and the religious leaders' rejection of God's plan would lead to the city's downfall. In the year 66 AD, the first signs of revolt began to appear. The Jewish people, exhausted by Roman rule, finally revolted. This revolt, known as the Great Revolt of the Jews, was the beginning of the end for Jerusalem. For 4 years, the Jews fought against the powerful Roman army, which responded with brutal force. However, the climax of this conflict occurred in the year 70, when the Roman general Caiaphas surrounded Jerusalem with his legions. The siege was incredible, and the horrors experienced in the city were indescribable. During the siege, the temple, which had been the center of power for Anna and her, was destroyed. The scenes that followed were terrifying. Fegaus Sefu, a Jewish historian of the time, describes in detail the destruction of time. He relates that the fire consumed the sacred building and that the Roman soldiers, in their fury, overthrew stone after stone, as Jesus had prophesied. Imagine the devastating impact this must have had on the priest and the people. The temple, which for generations had been the place where sacrifices were made, where people sought God's presence, was now just a ruined heap. The cries of pain of the defeated Jews mingled with the cries of triumph of the Romans, who plundered the temple and took as trophies precious vessels of gold. These sacred treasures were exhibited in the great apparatus of victory in Rome, as symbols of the humility of a people. For Anna and her, had they been alive to witness these events, they would have seen the total collapse of the system they had worked so hard to protect. Lau condemned Jesus to maintain his position and avoid Roman intervention. But now, paradoxically, it was the Romans who destroyed everything they had fought to maintain. The temple was not just a building, it symbolized the whole religious system you want. The destruction of the temple was the end of the Levitical priesthood, the end of the sacrifices, and the end of the worship system that had been anchored by figures like Anna and Caiaphas. They tried to protect their positions, but in the process rejected the very job that could have brought salvation to them and the people. And now what's left? Only ruins and ashes, witness of the fulfillment of the prophecies of Jesus. And so the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple marked the end of an era. The system that Anna and the EF had built and manipulated collapsed. The city that was supposed to be God's house on earth was handed over to foreign conquerors. This event was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The temple, the pride of Jerusalem, the place where the priests performed their rituals, no longer existed. And with him, Anna's power and influence and his likeness disappeared. Jesus baptized in Matthew 23:37, Jesus, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you. How many times I wanted to gather your children together, like a hen gathers her chicks under her body, but you didn't want to. Behold, your house will be desolate. These words echoed many times in the hearts of those who lived to see the destruction of the city. The house of God, the temple, was now desolate. And with that, the entire religious system that Anna and she represented had come to an end. But as the old system collapsed, something new emerged. Christianity, which Anna and others tried to suppress, was spreading throughout the world. The gospel, the message of the new covenant, no longer depended on a physical temple. Now, as it says in Hebrews 12:28, the words once again indicate the removal of what can be squee, that is, created things, so that what cannot be scudi may remain. Therefore, since we receive an unshakable kingdom, let us be thankful and worship God acceptably, reverently, and respectfully. What Anna and her like built was destroyed, and erased from history. God love you. Bye.